On a quiet morning, the sea stretched endlessly, reflecting soft shades of blue and silver. A small boat drifted gently toward Coral Island, a place rarely visited and whispered about in old sailor tales. Leo, Mia, and Sam had prepared for weeks. Their goal, a hidden cove said to shelter a pirate treasure lost centuries ago. The island appeared slowly over the horizon. Jagged cliffs rising sharply from the water. Seagulls circled above, their cries blending with the gentle lapping of waves against the boat. As they approached the shore, Leo noticed unusual markings carved into the rocks. They were old and worn, almost erased by wind and rain. Yet they seemed to form a map. Stepping onto the sand, the trio followed the trail carefully. The jungle ahead was dense, sunlight barely touching the ground. They walked slowly, avoiding roots and tangled vines, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. Small streams crossed their path, the water clear and cool as it trickled over smooth stones. Hours passed as they navigated through the undergrowth. They climbed gentle slopes, stepped over fallen branches, and circled around rocky outcrops. Occasionally, the path narrowed, and they had to squeeze between large boulders, each step careful and deliberate. In the distance, they could hear the faint roar of a waterfall. When they finally reached the waterfall, they discovered a narrow opening behind the cascading water. It led to a hidden cave, its entrance partially concealed by moss and vines. Inside, the air was cool and damp. They moved slowly, their footsteps echoing softly, until a wooden chest came into view, partially buried under stones. Pushing the debris aside, they opened the chest. Coins and jewels glimmered in the muted light. Alongside them lay a compass, its needle still steady despite the years. They carefully selected a few coins, leaving most behind, and marked the spot on a map to preserve the discovery for future travelers. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in gentle shades of orange and pink, the friends sailed away from the island. The water reflected the colors of the sky, calm and soothing. Coral Island faded behind them, quiet and mysterious, holding its secrets safely for another day. The watchtower stood on a narrow stretch of stone, where the land ended and the sea began. Built generations earlier, it had once guided ships through fog and storm. Its fire visible from far beyond the horizon. Now the tower remained unlit, its purpose nearly forgotten, yet still facing the water as it always had. Each evening, waves reached the rocks below with slow, steady rhythm. The tide rose and fell without urgency, reshaping the shoreline grain by grain. Gulls circled above the tower, resting briefly on the railing before drifting back toward the open water. The path leading to the watchtower was narrow and uneven. It passed through tall grass and wind-shaped shrubs, ending at a wooden door reinforced with iron bands. The hinges creaked when opened, a sound carried easily by the sea air. Inside, the tower was simple. A spiral staircase wound upward along the stone wall. Small windows allowed thin lines of light to enter, marking the passage of time as the sun moved across the sky. Dust rested undisturbed on the steps, except where the stone had been worn smooth by years of use. At the top of the tower, the lantern room remained intact. Thick glass panes surrounded the circular space, some slightly clouded by salt. The iron frame still held the mechanism that once supported the fire. Though unused, it showed careful craftsmanship. Each piece fitted precisely into place. From this height, the coastline stretched in both directions. To the north, cliffs dropped sharply into dark water. To the south, the land sloped gently into beaches where waves arrived in quiet repetition. Far offshore, ships appeared as small shapes, moving slowly across the horizon. As night approached, the sky shifted through muted colors. Gray softened into deep blue, and stars began to appear one by one. The sea reflected faint light, its surface never completely still. The watchtower remained silent as darkness settled. No flame was lit. Yet the structure continued its vigil, facing the open water as it had for centuries. Wind passed through the open windows, and the steady sound of waves carried on through the night, unchanged. On the far edge of the northern coast, where the land ended in dark stone and the sea stretched without limit, there stood a lighthouse. It was old, taller than most buildings in nearby towns, and built from thick gray blocks that had survived many storms. The lighthouse stood alone on a narrow cliff separated from the nearest village by several miles of rough coastal road. Few people visited it anymore. Ships passed farther out at sea, guided by modern navigation systems, but the lighthouse remained active. Every night, as it had for over 100 years, its light turned slowly across the water. The keeper of the lighthouse was a man named Elias Crow. Elias lived in the small stone house connected to the tower. His days followed a steady routine. He woke early, often before sunrise, and walked the grounds around the lighthouse, checking for damage from wind or salt spray. He cleaned the lenses, inspected the gears, and recorded weather conditions in a large leather-bound logbook. The lighthouse had never been automated. Local authorities decided long ago that it was safer with a keeper present, especially during heavy storms, when equipment could fail. Elias did not mind the isolation. The sea provided constant movement and sound. Waves struck the rocks below, seabirds circled overhead, and foghorns from distant ships called through the mist. One morning, while inspecting the base of the tower, Elias noticed something unusual. Near the edge of the cliff, partially hidden by tall grass, there was a wooden crate. It was darkened by water and marked with faded letters that were difficult to read. Elias approached carefully. The crate was sealed, but damaged, as if it had been carried by the sea and thrown onto the rocks below before somehow reaching the top of the cliff. He examined it closely. There were no warning labels, no signs of danger. Only a simple symbol carved into the wood. A circle with a single line through its center. Using a small pry bar from his tool shed, Elias opened the crate. Inside, wrapped in thick cloth, was a brass instrument. It was shaped like a lantern, but heavier, with glass panels that were slightly tinted blue. Along its base were small markings, etched carefully into the metal. Elias had never seen anything like it. He carried the object inside the lighthouse and placed it on the work table beneath the main lens. For several hours, he examined it from every angle, trying to understand its purpose. There were no switches, no obvious power source. But when Elias adjusted one of the small dials near the base, the glass began to glow faintly. The light was soft and steady, unlike the bright white beam of the lighthouse. It did not flicker or fade. That night, Elias decided to test the strange lantern. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, he lit the lighthouse as usual. The massive lens rotated smoothly, sending its beams across the darkening sea. Then, carefully, Elias placed the brass lantern near one of the tower's narrow windows. At first, nothing seemed to happen. But as the lighthouse beam passed over the water, the blue glow from the lantern began to stretch outward, forming a thin line across the surface of the sea. Elias watched closely. The line of light did not replace the lighthouse beam. Instead, it followed it, slightly below, tracing the waves with surprising precision. Moments later, a distant ship altered its course. Elias recognized the vessel. It was a cargo ship that often passed too close to the rocky shoreline. It turned earlier than usual, moving safely toward deeper water. Elias noticed the change in his logbook. Over the next several nights, Elias repeated the experiment. Each time the lantern was placed near the window, its soft blue light extended across the sea. And each time, ships adjusted their paths more smoothly, avoiding dangerous shallows without sudden turns or warning signals. Word began to spread among sailors. Some claimed the light felt clearer than normal navigation signals. Others said it appeared during fog, when other lights seemed dull or distorted. One evening, a small fishing boat approached the lighthouse dock, something that rarely happened. A fisherman climbed the stone steps and knocked on Elias's door. "We've noticed something," the man said. "Your light seems different lately. It's easier to follow." Elias nodded, but said little. He continued his routine, maintaining the lighthouse while quietly using the lantern each night. He never moved it outside the tower. It remained a silent companion, glowing patiently beside the great rotating lens. Weeks passed, and storms arrived. Heavy winds battered the coast, and rain lashed against the stone walls. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The lighthouse beam struggled against the thick fog. On the worst night of the storm, Elias climbed the tower with the lantern in his arms. The wind howled through cracks in the stone. The windows rattled violently. Elias placed the lantern at the highest window and adjusted its dial fully. The blue light brightened. Outside, the fog seemed to thin along the lantern's path. Not completely, but enough to form a narrow corridor of visibility over the water. Later reports confirmed that 3 ships passed safely through the storm that night, guided by the lighthouse when other signals failed. After the storm, officials visited the lighthouse. They inspected the structure, reviewed Elias's logs, and noted the unusually low number of maritime incidents in the area. They asked if anything had changed. Elias simply said, "The lights being well maintained." The officials accepted the answer. Years passed. Elias continued his work, and the lighthouse continued to turn its beam across the sea each night. The brass lantern remained beside it, unchanged and steady. When Elias eventually retired, a new keeper took his place. The lantern was never mentioned in official records, never removed, never studied. It stayed where it was. And to this day, sailors say that along that stretch of coast, the light is different. Clearer, steadier, as if something within the lighthouse never sleeps. In a small village surrounded by hills and meadows, there was a hidden garden known only to a few. People said the plants in the garden whispered if you listened carefully. It was a quiet place, overgrown with moss-covered stones, flowering vines, and a small bubbling brook that wound its way through the center. A young woman named Mary discovered the garden one sunny afternoon. She had wandered farther than usual while exploring the countryside, chasing the soft hum of bees and the sweet scent of blooming flowers. When she found the garden, she stopped at the entrance and hesitated. It felt as though the air itself was welcoming her in. Mary wandered slowly along the winding paths. She noticed how the leaves seemed to shimmer when sunlight passed through them, and how the flowers bent slightly, almost as if nodding in greeting. She knelt beside the brook and listened. If she closed her eyes, she could hear faint whispers, the rustling of petals, the gentle chatter of water, the sigh of the wind through tall grass. Every day after that, Mary returned to the garden. She carried a small notebook and wrote down the shapes of the flowers, the patterns of the stones, and the songs of the birds. Sometimes she brought seeds to plant, careful not to disturb the natural calm of the garden. Slowly, she realized that the garden was teaching her patience. It asked her to slow down, to notice small details, and to simply be present. One afternoon, as a gentle rain fell, Mary saw a tiny bud she hadn't noticed before. It was pale and delicate, trembling under the raindrops. She whispered to it softly, and for a moment it seemed to glow. Mary felt a quiet warmth in her chest, as though the garden had heard her and replied in its own subtle way. Years passed, and Mary grew older. But she continued to visit the garden. The villagers sometimes asked why she spent so much time there, and she would only smile. The garden was more than a place. It was a companion, a teacher, and a reminder that beauty could be found in quiet moments, if only one paused long enough to notice. And so the garden remained, tucked away at the edge of the village, whispering softly to anyone who cared to listen. Evan found the letter while cleaning out a drawer he hadn't opened in years. It was folded neatly, once, then again. The edges softened by time. His own handwriting stared back at him. Careful, deliberate, the kind he used when he didn't want to make a mistake. He didn't remember writing it, but as he held it, he remembered the feeling. The letter had been written on a quiet afternoon long ago, when the world felt paused. Evan had been younger then, full of thoughts he didn't yet know how to carry. Writing had seemed easier than speaking. Paper didn't interrupt. Paper didn't misunderstand. He unfolded the page. The first line was simple. I don't know if I'll ever give this to you. Evan smiled faintly. That sounded like him. The letter went on, not with grand confessions or dramatic promises, but with observations. Small things. How silence felt heavier some days than others. How he had learned to enjoy mornings more than nights. How there were moments he wished he could rewind. Not to change anything, but to sit in them a little longer. There was no name written anywhere on the page. That had been intentional. At the time, Evan hadn't known who the letter was for. He only knew it was meant for someone important. Someone who might one day exist, or someone who already did but didn't yet feel reachable. He read slowly, letting each sentence settle. I think people carry more than they show," the letter said. "And sometimes they get tired of holding it alone." Evan exhaled quietly. He remembered that thought. It had come to him while watching strangers pass by, each absorbed in their own lives. He had wondered how many stories crossed paths without ever colliding. The letter didn't ask for anything. It didn't demand understanding. It simply explained. As he reached the end, the final lines stood out the most. "If this letter stays here forever, that's okay. Writing it was enough." Evan folded the page again and sat back. He thought about all the moments since then. The conversations he never had. The ones he did. The choices that quietly shaped his days. He thought about how much of life happened internally. Unseen. Unshared. The letter had never been sent. But it hadn't been wasted. It had captured a version of him that no longer existed. Preserved in ink. A reminder that even unanswered thoughts had value. That expressing something, even privately, could lighten the weight of it. Evan placed the letter back into the drawer. Not because he wanted to forget it, but because he knew where it was now. Some things didn't need an audience. They just needed a place to rest. He closed the drawer gently and continued cleaning, feeling oddly lighter, as if the letter had done its job, even after all these years. Every night, at exactly 9 o'clock, a small light turned on in the window of the house at the end of Cedar Street. No one remembered when it first started. Some people said it had always been there. Others said it appeared one winter and never went away. But everyone noticed it, because the house itself was old, quiet, and usually dark. The light was warm and yellow. It did not flicker. It did not change. It simply stayed on, night after night. Emma noticed it during her evening walks home from work. Cedar Street was a shortcut she had taken for years. But lately, she found herself slowing down when she reached the end of the road. The light felt comforting somehow, like a promise that something steady still existed in the world. Emma lived alone in a small apartment nearby. Her days were busy, but predictable. Work, errands, dinner, sleep. Nothing was wrong, exactly. But nothing felt especially right either. Life felt like it was moving forward without asking her opinion. One evening, as she passed the house, she noticed something new. The front door was open. She stopped walking. The house looked the same as always. Tall, narrow, with peeling paint and overgrown plants. But the open door felt strange. The light in the window was still on, glowing softly. Emma hesitated. She told herself it was none of her business. Old houses had drafts. Doors opened. Things happened. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was waiting. She took a step closer. "Hello?" she called. Her voice quieter than she expected. No answer. Emma stood there for a long moment, listening. The street was empty. No cars, no voices, only the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. Finally, she stepped inside. The air smelled like dust and old paper. The entryway was narrow but clean. There were no broken floorboards, no signs of damage. It felt cared for. The light she had seen from outside came from a small lamp on a wooden table in the next room. Emma followed it. The room was simple. A chair, a table, shelves filled with notebooks. Hundreds of them. Each one carefully labeled with dates. Emma ran her fingers along the spines. The earliest date was decades old. "What is this place?" she whispered. "You could call it a record." The voice came from behind her. Emma turned quickly, her heart racing. An older man stood near the doorway. He had kind eyes and silver hair, and he smiled as if she were expected. "I'm sorry," Emma said quickly. "I didn't mean to. Your door was open." "I know," the man said gently. "It was meant to be." Emma frowned. "Meant to be?" He nodded. "You've been noticing the light for a while now." She felt a small chill. Yes. That's usually how it starts. He gestured toward the chair. Please, sit. Emma didn't know why she listened, but she did. The chair was solid and comfortable. The man picked up one of the notebooks. These are moments, he said. Small ones. Ordinary ones. The kind people forget. Emma looked at him. Why keep them? Because they matter, he replied. Even when no one else thinks they do. He opened a notebook and read aloud. March 12th. A woman laughed unexpectedly while waiting for her coffee. She surprised herself. Emma's breath caught. That had been her, years ago. She stared at him. How do you know that? The man smiled softly. This house watches. Not in a way that judges. Only in a way that remembers. Emma felt her chest tighten. Why? Because people forget themselves, he said. They forget who they were and who they still are. He closed the notebook. The light, Emma said slowly. What is it? It's a signal, he replied, for those who feel a little lost. It says something is still here. Emma swallowed. Why me? The man considered her for a moment. Because you've been walking past your own life instead of stepping into it. The words landed gently but firmly. Emma looked down at her hands. I don't know how to change that. You don't have to change everything, he said. Only notice. He handed her a notebook. A blank one. This one is yours, he said. Emma took it. The cover was plain. What do I do with it? Write what matters, he said, even if it feels small. She nodded slowly. When Emma looked up again, the man was gone. The room was quiet. She stood, notebook in hand, and walked back toward the door. Before leaving, she turned off the lamp. The house went dark. The next night, Emma turned on the light in her own window. The notebook had been sitting on the desk for months. Marcus had bought it on impulse. The cover was plain. The pages thick and unmarked. At the time, he had imagined filling it with ideas, plans, or something important. Instead, it stayed close. This morning, he noticed it again. The room was quiet, except for the sound of distant traffic. Marcus sat down and placed the notebook in front of him. He opened it carefully, as if the pages might already contain something fragile. They were empty. He stared at the first page longer than necessary. The blank space felt larger than it should have been. It made him aware of how often he waited. Waited to feel ready. Waited to know what to write. Waited for the right moment. Marcus picked up a pen. He didn't try to create anything meaningful. He wrote the date. Then he wrote a single sentence about the way the morning felt. Nothing more. The pen moved slowly, but it moved. After that, he closed the notebook and stood up. The action felt small, but it changed the tone of the room. The desk no longer felt like a place of delay. Marcus stepped outside. The air was cooler than he expected. A few clouds moved lazily across the sky. People passed without noticing him, each carrying their own thoughts, their own unseen lists of concerns. He walked without purpose, letting his thoughts stay unfinished. At a corner he rarely took, Marcus stopped. The street ahead was unfamiliar, yet calm. He turned onto it without thinking. The walk didn't lead to anything special. There was no discovery waiting at the end. But when Marcus eventually returned home, he felt different. Not inspired. Not motivated. Just slightly more present. Back at the desk, Marcus opened the notebook again. He added one more sentence. Then he closed it. That was enough for today. The notebook remained mostly empty, but it was no longer untouched. At the edge of a small town, where the houses slowly gave way to open fields, there lived a bird named Ellen. She was not a large bird, and she was not colorful in any way that made people stop and point. Her feathers were soft shades of brown, and gray, the colors of earth and clouds before rain. Because of this, Ellen was often overlooked. But Ellen noticed everything. Each morning, she woke before the sun. She felt the cool air resting gently on her feathers and listened to the quiet sounds of the world preparing itself for the day. Far away, a dog might bark once. Somewhere close, leaves whispered as they moved in the breeze. Ellen liked this time best, when the world felt honest and unhurried. Ellen lived in a tall tree that had watched many seasons pass. Its branches were strong but kind, bending just enough to protect her from harsh winds. From her place near the top, Ellen could see far across the fields. She saw people walking, cars passing, and other birds flying with confidence and speed. Ellen could fly, of course. She had learned like all birds do. But she flew carefully, never too high and never too far. The open sky made her uneasy. It felt too wide, too full of unknown paths. So she stayed close to familiar places, returning again and again to the same branches, the same views, the same gentle routines. One morning, as the sun began to paint the sky with pale gold, Ellen noticed a bird she had never seen before. This bird flew higher than any Ellen had watched. Its wings moved with ease, and it seemed to trust the air completely. It circled once, twice, and then rested briefly on a nearby wire. Ellen studied the bird in silence. "You fly very high," Ellen finally said. The bird turned its head and looked at her. "I do," it repeated calmly. "Isn't it frightening?" Ellen asked. "Being so far from the ground?" The bird made a soft sound that might have been a laugh. "At first, yes, but the sky becomes familiar if you spend enough time with it." With that, the bird lifted off again and disappeared into the brightening morning. Ellen could not stop thinking about those words. The sky becomes familiar. The day passed as usual. Ellen flew short distances, found food, rested, and watched the world move below her. But something inside her felt different, like a small door had opened and refused to close. That evening, as the light faded and the air cooled, Ellen stood on her branch and looked upward. The sky was no longer bright and endless. It was deep and calm, filled with slow-moving clouds and the first quiet stars. She spread her wings, then folded them again. "Not today," she whispered to herself. Days passed. The strange bird did not return. But its words stayed with Ellen. She began to fly a little higher each day. Not much, just enough to feel the air change. Just enough to notice how the world below became smaller and quieter. She learned new things as she did this. She learned that the wind had different voices depending on how high you listened. She learned that fear did not disappear all at once, but thinned slowly like mist in the morning light. One afternoon, dark clouds gathered quickly. The wind grew sharp, and rain began to fall without warning. Ellen flew toward her tree, but a strong gust pushed her off course. For the first time, she was forced higher than she had ever planned to go. Her heart raced. The ground seemed far away, and the rain blurred everything she knew. But then, something unexpected happened. Up there, above the rushing wind near the ground, the air was steadier. The rain softened. Ellen realized that by flying higher, she had found calm instead of chaos. She adjusted her wings and let the air carry her. When the storm passed, Ellen found herself gliding smoothly. Her fear replaced by a quiet focus. She felt present in a way she had never felt before. The sky was no longer an empty space. It was a place with layers, moods, and kindness she had never discovered from below. When she returned to her tree, everything looked the same. But she was not. From that day on, Ellen flew higher. Not always, and not without care, but with trust. She explored the sky the way she once studied the fields. She learned when to rise and when to return. She learned that courage did not mean leaving everything behind, but allowing yourself to grow beyond what once felt safe. Sometimes, as she rested in the early morning light, Ellen thought she saw a familiar bird flying far above. And though they never spoke again, she felt grateful. Because the sky, once so distant and frightening, had become a place she understood. And Ellen, the small, quiet bird, had learned that even the widest spaces can feel like home when you give yourself time to know them.